Hello, Petal. How are you doing today? How's your week going so far? There's a fun thing I'm looking out for at the moment, and it's the 50 greatest boss battles of all time. I think it's 50, but I might be wrong. If you look back on your lifetime, what's the biggest boss battles you've had? You don't have to say so. I mean, it could be computer games, it could be ones you've seen in films or TVs. But is there anything that you can recall? Any in a book? Let me know. Let me know what you think. But we are up to chapter 2. As ever, if you could ding the bing bing, if they could hit that notifications bell or hit a like if you enjoy it, or a share or subscribe, that's always awesome. And to everybody that's joined our little community, I love having you here. I know I say it every time, and if I get tiresome of saying it, then please say so. But I don't know, it makes me feel all fluffy inside. But yes, we are at chapter 2 of May Contain Traces of Magic, J.W. Wells & Co. Book 6, and I hope you're enjoying it so far. By the looks of it, you are. Anyway, I'll stop whiffling and we'll get cracking. Chapter 2. There were 2 women on his shoulders, one beautiful and nice, one ugly and nasty, and as he approached the end of the road, they were both yelling at him. Turn left, urged the nice one. Turn right, said the nasty one, and he wished they'd both shut up so he could think. And the junction was getting closer and closer, but instead of slowing down, he was speeding up toward the brick wall, so unless he decided which way to turn right now, he was going to crash and die. The noise wasn't screaming brakes, after all. It was the alarm clock. He shot out a hand, knocked it over, groped, grabbed it, erupted out of bed and ran, his thumb still searching for the stupid little button that turned the stupid thing off, safely into the kitchen. And Chris was fairly sure that he'd made it without waking Karen up. She was, he supposed, a nice enough person, really, but if her sleep was disturbed, she turned into a monstrous, clawed, snarling thing, and stayed that way the rest of the day. He flopped down in a chair, put the clock on the table and caught his breath. Then, very carefully, he sneaked back into the bedroom and got his clothes. 5:15 in the fucking morning. Chris didn't have time for breakfast, or even a bowl of kettle, but his mouth was sticky and foul, and he desperately needed caffeine in some form. He caught sight of the coffee pot, picked it up, and felt a certain amount of liquid shifting around inside it. Last night's coffee, cold and full of grounds. He put the spout to his mouth, tilted the pot and glugged thrice. Disgusting, but better than nothing. I am not a morning person, Chris admitted to himself as he tried to remember how to tie shoelaces. On the other hand, this isn't the morning, it's the middle of the fucking night. Therefore, I am in my element, on the top of my form, 100% functional and ready for anything. Right, then, let's go. The car purred into life with a tickle of the key, revoltingly happy, like a dog being taken for a walk. Chris had remembered the stupid carrier bag, or at least tripped over it in the hall. He remembered how he'd violated it last night. In the brain-bleaching banality of early morning, he wondered why the hell it had seemed like such a big deal, and set his course accordingly. Jill lived in one of those interesting old industrial buildings converted into flats, right at the very top. She'd told him about it once, and it had turned out to be rather less interesting than he first thought. There was a glass and steel porch with a buzzer box. He pressed a number, put the carrier down, and someone had eaten the biscuits. Chris frowned. Was I drunk last night? He wondered. Couldn't remember, which argued that he had been, but the absence of hangover proved conclusively that he hadn't. Karen, then. It was possible. She'd been known to get up in the middle of the night and eat things. Embarrassing, but too late to do anything about it now. Chris glanced at his watch. Running late, needless to say. He really didn't want to concede the moral high ground to the thin trainee by keeping her waiting. He hopped back into the car and put his foot down. She was there when he pulled in, the only living creature in the car park. He opened the door and she got in. "Sorry I'm late," he said. "Only I had to." "It's all right." Ah, he thought, yet another one who won't let me finish a sentence. Just what I needed, really. She was red-haired and pale, with a nose and chin that looked as though they'd just emerged from a pencil sharpener, and she seemed to be huddling inside her clothes as though trying to minimise the contact between the hated fabric and her skin. Not that Chris could blame her. 10-to-1 her mother had chosen the suit for her. First impressions are so important, dear. If that was how it had been, Mummy had succeeded beyond her wildest dreams, though someone should have told her that not all impressions are good. It made the girl look like a prisoner of war, captured in some particularly bloody engagement between two opposing armies of chartered accountants. Well, Chris thought, fine. She doesn't want to be here. I don't want her here. In a reasonably logical world, we'd do a deal. I'd drop her off wherever she wanted to go. We'd both pretend she'd done the rounds with me, and both of us would have a marginally less excruciating day. But it doesn't work like that, does it? So, he said cheerfully. The trainee was staring through the windscreen at some indefinite distant point. So, he repeated, you're Angela. She didn't look round, but maybe her mouth tightened just a little. I'm Chris, he ground on. Hello. And you're doing the Graduate Intake Initiative. That's right. They tell you, practically from the cradle, that man is a social animal. Loneliness is a truly terrible thing, and humans can really only be happy in the company of their fellow creatures. Shocking, the way they're allowed to lie to you like that. That's where the firm pays for your college tuition and stuff, and in return you come and work for us afterwards. Well, Chris thought, at least she's not one of those terrible gabby females who won't ever shut up. Indeed, quite the bloody opposite. Well, he said, I guess I'd better fill you in on what we're going to be doing today. First, we'll be calling on cotterels. They're what we call a typical mum and dad independent. There's quite a lot of them still, though the big foreign multiples are just starting to get established over here. Zauberwerk and boutiques de magie and sorcery sauce. But they're still only, 15% of the overall sector as a whole? I know all that, Angela said, each word an effort, like digging coal. I'm doing my dissertation on the structure of the magical retail trade, so you don't need to tell me. A very faint emphasis on the you. Well, that was fine too. A dissertation, Chris replied. Fancy. That must be a lot of hard work. Okay, Chris said to himself. Let's not talk. Let's sit here in stony silence, me driving, you hating the whole of creation. He drove, therefore, for a quarter of an hour, allowing his mind to drift. Bloody burnouts, he thought, lumbering me like this, and what's it going to be like at the shops? If I chance I'll have to do any selling with this millstone round my neck, how am I supposed to do my job with... He realised he didn't have the faintest idea where he was. Silly. He drove these roads for a living. He knew every alley, lane and byway. Except this one, he admitted. Must have taken a wrong turn somewhere. Chris thought. Under normal circumstances, in which, of course, this wouldn't have happened to begin with, it'd just flip on SatNav, and she'd have him out of there and back on the straight and narrow in a minute or two. For some reason, though, he really didn't want to use SatNav while the miserable girl was in the car, as if she wouldn't understand, as if it'd somehow be inappropriate, like snogging in the office. He looked in the mirror, then straight ahead, just in case he'd missed some obvious landmark he could triangulate by. No such luck. He said. You wouldn't mind just getting that map off the back seat, would you? Angela turned her head and looked at him. Why don't you use your GPS? It was a moment before Chris realised what she was talking about. Oh, that, he said. Bust. Doesn't work. Been meaning to get a new one. Forgive me, he thought, but it was switched off and couldn't absolve him. All right, she stretched past him and got the map, but I'm rubbish at map reading. A truthful girl, whatever her other faults. If she'd been Columbus's navigator on the Santa Maria, the world's leading superpower in the 21st century would probably have been Australia. Eventually, After a misguided tour of half the lanes with grass growing up the middle in the Midlands, they floundered out onto a dual carriageway that he knew, unfortunately going the wrong way. But it only took 10 minutes to get to a junction where they could turn around, and that left them a mere 45 minutes behind schedule. "Did you get lost a lot?" she asked.
"No,"
Chris replied. Thanks to some dangerously reckless driving, Angela didn't approve of speeding, Chris could tell, they reached Cotterell's an hour after they should have arrived. Not good. Mandy, the manageress, was a nice girl, but heavily into punctuality.
"This is Angela,"
Chris said. He found he still couldn't remember her surname.
"She's going round with me for a few weeks, learning the ropes."
Mandy, the manageress, smiled at her, and he could practically feel the goodwill bounce off and shatter. Great start. It was as though all the friendliness and rapport he'd built up here over the last few years had been hoovered up into a great black bag. Mandy was distinctly chilly as he tried in vain to interest her in the new range of bottled dreams, and the portable parking spaces went down like a lead balloon. Even the DW6 order was down by a dozen on last time. Yes, but what do they do with it? And he wasn't offered a cup of tea, which was definitely a first. Curiously, when they got back in the car and set off for the next call, the girl seemed marginally happier. At least the sharp edge of her frown blurred just a little, and after 10 minutes she spoke without being spoken to first. "You didn't have much luck there," she said.
"No."
"I don't think that woman likes you very much."
"Mandy?"
Chris frowned.
"Oh, she's all right. We get on pretty well, usually."
Pause. Then, "I expect it's really important, getting on well with the customers."
"It helps," he said. "I mean, obviously there's going to be some who just don't want to know, but basically we're all in the same business. If they want stuff to sell to their customers, they've got to get it from somewhere, and our range just happens to be one of the best in the trade. Got to believe in what you're selling," he went on, "because if you don't, they pick up on it really quickly, and then it's forget it. Believe in the stock and try and be nice to people. That's really all there is to it."
Angela shrugged, as if to imply that the other one was festooned with little tinkly silver bells. "I don't think I'd be any good at this," she said. "I don't get on well with people."
No, Chris thought, you don't. "It's a knack," he said. "You learn it, along with the other tricks of the trade. Mind you, it helps if you like the sound of your own voice."
"I don't," she said. "I think my voice sounds horrible."
Two things we agree about. At this rate, we could be friends. "So, you aren't planning on going into the marketing side, then?"
Angela shook her head. "Research and development," she said. "I've got extremely advanced magical abilities, or at least that's what they told me when I went for my interview. They seemed very keen to have me," she added mournfully, "especially when I told them about my uncle."
"In the trade, is he?"
She nodded. "Professor of Applied Effective Magic at UCLA, she said. And his father was head of demonology for Leclerc Frere in Sao Paulo, so it sort of runs in the family."
"Sounds like it,"
Chris replied, trying really hard not to sound in any way jealous or resentful.
"Of course," he went on, "my granddad was in the trade too."
"Oh, yes."
He nodded. "Senior charge hand at JWW Industrial by the time he retired. Spent most of his working life in the genie bottling plant. Very responsible job, you can imagine."
Angela didn't see anything, and on balance Chris approved of her decision. Not a lot to be said, really. But the silence got on his nerves after a bit. So he said,
"Research and development generally, or is there anything particular you're..."
"Well," she said, "in my second year I did quite a bit on transmigration of energy. You know, spontaneous generation of morphogenic fields. Subatomic disruption, ionic interface resequencing. All pretty basic stuff, but potentially quite interesting if you look at it from the standpoint of effective metanormal transmutation. and my tutor's currently working in theoretical cross-dimensional transmigration, which of course would change everything if he can make it work. So I think I'd quite like to be in on that, if it comes to anything, I mean. The practical applications in the construction and entertainment sectors alone would be pretty exciting, not to mention the possibility of finally bridging the effective practical dichotomy. Chris tuned out. It was depressing, and she made it sound like science, and surely the whole point of what they did in the trade was that it wasn't science, it was better. All that stuff about energy and atoms and ions, it sort of took the magic out of it. Somehow. At any rate, she seemed happy enough babbling on about it, and she clearly hadn't noticed how what she was saying was affecting him. That, or she just didn't care. All in all, he was in a thoroughly bad mood when they rolled up outside Domestic and Commercial Magic for their next call.
"Just let me do the talking. All right," he said,
which he'd have been the first to admit was like telling the Pacific Ocean not to catch fire.
"This lot, well, I'm not saying they're difficult exactly. More sort of cautious. Don't particularly like reps, but I can handle them, so..."
Angela nodded, and Chris led the way into the shop. It was the smell, more than anything, a strong but delicate scent of violets and roses combined with just a hint of wood smoke. A civilian would have taken no notice or made a mental note to ask the shopkeeper where they got their potpourri from. But Chris was no civilian, and he'd come across that smell before.
"Get out," he said. "Back the way you came. Don't look at anything. Do it."
Pitched the tone of voice just right, and even graduate trainees will do as they're told. Angela backed out of the shop. Chris really wanted to follow her, but he couldn't, not without looking, just in case there were survivors. Not that there'd be much he could do for them. Slowly, he turned his head, and for a moment he wondered if he'd lost it completely and made all that fuss over nothing. No blood, severed limbs, giblet splatters on the walls, the shop fittings untrashed, the stockroom door still squarely on its hinges, but the shelves behind the counter were bare, and he knew without having to look further that there was nobody else in the shop. Nobody human. But why? He asked himself. Not that they need a reason. One of the things that made Chris uncomfortable about what Jill did for a living was the heroism element. She never called it that, of course. Pulled a face at him if he ever used the word, but that didn't mean it wasn't appropriate, and he had this thing about heroes. Didn't hold with them. They made him nervous, mostly because he simply couldn't fathom what made them do all that stuff. Why anybody with more brains than a teaspoon would willingly advance into danger when they could perfectly well run away, he couldn't begin to understand. Altruism, to save others, to make a difference. The thrill, the adrenaline rush. The only time you feel really alive is when you're staring death in the tonsils. He'd heard all the justifications loads of times from some of the best heroes in the business. Made no difference. He still didn't understand. He was, therefore, both surprised and extremely unhappy with himself for taking a couple of very tentative steps forward, away from the door, towards the counter. Out of my tiny little mind, he told himself. Why the hell am I doing this? And the only answer he got was, "Please hold, we'll get back to you as soon as we've figured that out for ourselves." In the years and decades and centuries and millennia it took for him to cross the 7 yards separating the door from the counter, Chris tried to remember everything he'd ever learned about Domestic and Commercial Magic Limited that might conceivably be relevant. Didn't take long. They were an average run-of-the-mill small chain operation consisting of 5 shops in the West and South Midlands, stocking an unambitious range of general merchandise for the commercial, manufacturing, construction and entertainment and media sectors, with small but active niche markets in spatio-temporal design and archaic enchanted weaponry. Oh, Chris thought. 3 guesses what they came for, then. He'd reached the counter. Very slowly, he leaned across to see if there was anything. there was. He had to look twice before he could make a positive identification. Looking back the second time was the most unpleasant task he'd ever set himself, and he wasn't getting paid for it, or earning brownie points, or anything. Poor Mr. Newsom. Not his favourite shop manager by any stretch of the imagination. He had an infuriating habit of whistling softly under his breath while you were trying to pitch him a new line. He never took more than 4 dozen of anything, except DW6, of course, and he was a terror for sending back anything that had the slightest mark or crease on it. Over the years, Chris had got the impression from the 2 girls who worked there that Newsom was a bit of a martinet, inclined to snarl and whine about 65-minute lunch hours and incoming personal calls on the company's phone lines. Nearly everybody who'd ever met him compared him, appearance and personality, to Captain Mainwaring, but without, according to Veronica from Zauberwerk, the wit, charm and sex appeal. Not, then, the most endearing man who ever lived. Even so, whatever it was that had done for him had aimed for outright decapitation. Probably it had underestimated the density and tenacity of Mr. Newsom's unusually thick neck. Consequentially, it had managed to tear through the left side skin, flesh, tendons and blood vessels, and had cracked open the spinal column, but that was as far as it had managed to get. As a result, Mr. Newsom's head lay tilted to one side, as if it was a removable component that had got stuck. Apart from that, he looked fine. Suit neat, shirt hardly stained at all, shoes still bright, shiny, polished, nicely manicured hands, limp and relaxed at his sides. In an ideal world, you'd be able to fix him by unscrewing the damaged components and slotting in new ones. But the world isn't ideal, and even magic has its limitations. Poor Mr. Newsom. Oh well, Chris thought. I knew I recognised that smell, and I was right. Clever old me. Now do something really clever and get yourself out of here in one piece. From the counter to the door, 7 yards, 7 ordinary paces, 7 small steps for a man. No way in hell was he going to turn his back on the counter. He started to move, and, more to keep his mind occupied and off the thinking behind the counter he couldn't see, he looked around him at the otherwise perfectly normal shop that just happened not to have anything on its shelves right now. Correction. He'd missed something. In the middle of the top shelf, perfectly still and facing him, was the ugliest garden gnome he'd ever set eyes on in his life. Odd, Chris thought. That's the sort of thing you'd expect to see in a garden centre, rather than a magical goods shop. Not that anybody, not even the disturbed people who buy garden gnomes, would ever part with money for that. The gnome winked at him. Not supposed to do that. The gnome winked at him again and grinned, and now he came to think of it, that wasn't a gnome. It was something quite other, and the long, flat, shiny thing that it was holding in its palpably not gnome's hands wasn't a fishing rod either. Oh, he thought, well, it was a pretty lousy excuse for a life, but it'll be over any minute now, and then maybe I can be something else. The thing that demonstrably was not a gnome was looking at Chris, head tilted just a little on one side, considering him quite calmly, weighing up the necessary expenditure of effort against the likely rewards and benefits. He kept perfectly still while the unknown thing was thinking, just in case any action on his part, any slight movement, say, or funny little squeaky noise he might make, should affect the creature's judgment. It took its time, and he had a nasty feeling that his left foot, frozen in the act of taking a step back, was starting to go to sleep. He was wondering just how long he could keep it up, in fact, when the creature, not a gnome, quite sure about that, shook its disproportionately large head an inch or so from side to side, and its lips moved, shaping the words, "No, not today." As Chris put his weight on his numb left foot, he wobbled, and that made the creature twitch, like a wolf, he thought, instinctively programmed to react to movements of prey species that were suggestive of weakness or panic. But he kept going, and it didn't move, Oh, its eyes were still fixed on him, downloading information at a tremendous rate, every detail of his body, weight and mass, likely speed, agility, defensive and evasive capabilities. As his shoulders drew level with the frame of the open door, he saw it yawn. Then he spun round and ran. Angela was standing by the car for crying out loud. "Get in!" Chris howled, lunging for the door handle, his other hand scrabbling in his pockets for his keys. "What's going on?" she said. "Has something—"
"Get in the fucking car!"
Tone of voice, you see. Only he knew it wasn't something he'd be able to do in cold blood, so to speak. It needed that extra incentive. Chris didn't actually look to see if Angela was safely inside, or if she had fastened her seatbelt. He twisted the key, felt a stab of pure joy as the engine fired, and jabbed his elbow down on the locking pin to lock all the doors. A quick glance back towards the shop door, then a fluent wrench at the gear lever, and his left foot stamped down on the clutch. "Aren't we going to make the call, then?" Angela said. Chris reversed fast and without looking, felt the back end of the car bash into something, stuck the gear stick into first and floored the pedal round the corner. 30 seconds at maximum burn up the main road, then onto the first lay-by he came to. He didn't make a totally wonderful job of stopping, in fact. He rammed the car's nose into a hedge and stalled the engine. Then he wound down his window, stuck his head out of it, and... "Are you feeling all right?" Angela asked. Threw up with prodigious force, which was, he felt, about as much answer as her question merited.
"Fine,"
he croaked, wiping his mouth.
"Never fucking better. And you?"
Now she was looking at him as though he had two heads. "What's the matter?" she said. "There's something wrong, isn't there?"
"You might say that."
His hands were shaking so badly he couldn't even get his phone out of his pocket.
"Here," he snapped. "Make yourself useful and ring this number."
With surprising meekness, Angela took out her phone, flipped up the lid and waited. Chris couldn't remember the number, of course. It was stored in his phone along with all his other useful data.
"Call the office,"
he said, his voice flat as he gave her the number.
"Ask Julie on reception to get you the number for Felixstowe. She'll know what that means,"
he added quickly as her lips parted.
"Then dial that number and hand me the phone. Okay?"
He'd never actually spoken to Felixstowe before, and when a cool, brisk female voice came on the line and asked him which service he required, his mind went blank, and he sat frozen for several seconds while the phone squeaked hello at him until the girl poked him hard in the ribs and he pulled himself together with a snap.
"Demon control,"
Chris said. "Putting you through," said the cool voice, and a moment later a man was asking him where he was, how many, what subspecies.
"I don't know, do I?" Chris snapped. "Less I grate a spotted Ibbetson's fucking warbler. It was smallish and sort of grey. It was sitting on a shelf in a shop and it winked at me. All right."
The man told him there was no need to shout, which was, Chris strongly felt, simply not true, and started asking him for his name, date of birth, address, occupation, work and home phone numbers, email address. He gave it, then double-took and said, "What do you need my email address for?"
"We're compiling a database,"
the man replied,
"as part of our ongoing e-technology initiative. Would you like to receive our monthly newsletter?"
Quite some time later, the man told him to stay put, and a dedicated incident management team would be along at some point to sort it all out.
"Thank you for calling Demon Control Services,"
he concluded.
"Should you require further assistance, access our website at www...
"Here," the girl pointed out. "That's my phone. Don't do that, you'll break it."
"Sorry,"
Chris said, and handed it back. She put it away. "That didn't seem very helpful," she said. He shrugged.
"Government," he replied. "Anyway, they'll take it from here. None of our business anymore. We'll just stay put and wait for them, and everything'll be just fine,"
he added, glancing to make sure that the car doors were locked. Not, he reflected, that a little piece of glass and pressed steel sheet would slow up one of them for very long. Back there, Angela's voice was quieter and a little bit higher. "Was that really a—"
"Yes,"
Chris said. "Oh. Not scared, though?" He'd assumed it was fear, but it wasn't. He couldn't actually decide what it was. What had it done?
Killed the manager, he replied, which is unusual, he added, more thinking aloud than communicating, because they aren't usually that violent. I've got a friend in the agency and she's told me a bit about them. They don't usually attack unless they have to. It uses up a lot of energy and they're very efficient. He frowned. I don't think it was hungry. The body was just lying there, hadn't really been touched. Also, it had cleared off all the shells, like it was looking for something. My guess is it was there to get weapons. It's a line DCM specialise in, and the one I saw was holding something like a great big knife, sort of turning it over in its hands and looking at it the way you do when you've just bought something. Chris shivered. Anyway, like I said, not our problem. I'd better phone in and explain. Get Julie to ring round the shops, tell them we've been held up.
They arrived much sooner than he'd expected. A fleet of white vans, a couple of marked police cars, and suddenly he was being talked at by half a dozen people at once, all of them asking the same things, none of them appearing to listen to a word he said. They took no notice of the girl. She sat still and quiet for a long time, then got out a book and began to read.
It was shortish, sort of a grey colour, with a big head,
Chris said, for the 6th or 7th time.
And it just sat there on the shelf, grinning at me.
The man frowned, as if that made no sense at all.
Do you know if it was armed? Had it got a weapon of any kind?
Yes, I told that other man just now. It had a big sort of knife thing. I think it stole it from the shop.
Do you think the weapon might have come from the shop? They're listed as specialising in enchanted arms and armour.
Chris sighed.
You know what? It's a distinct possibility. Now you come to mention it. Never would have occurred to me, but...
The man was tapping something into a laptop resting on the car roof.
You'd better give me your full name, address, date of birth.
It occurred to Chris that unless he did something, this might very well continue for the rest of his life.
Just out of interest, he said, do you know someone called Jill Etton-Smith? She works in your department and...
The man looked up from his screen.
You know Jill?
He nodded. We were at school together.
Oh.
The man snapped his laptop shut. All right. Actually, she should be along any minute. Really? Small world.
Not really. She's the head of this department.
Chris was surprised and impressed. Jill talked about work a lot, sure, but very little, now he came to think about it, about what she actually did there, whether she was important or not, stuff like that. Part of him felt slightly ashamed at being surprised. The rest of him couldn't quite come to terms with someone who'd copied off him in maths at age 12 being put in charge of anything. He didn't see her, though. They stopped asking him questions, piled back into their vans and drove away, and he assumed she must have gone straight to the shop, which was fair enough, though surely there was very little chance that it would still be there after all this time, and it stood to reason. It was a serious business, and she was a professional, not to mention a head of department. Serious management. She wouldn't have time to stop off and pass the time of day with an old school friend, even though he'd obviously just had the shock of his life and could have done with the reassurance of a familiar face. Right, Chris said rather loudly. That's that. We'd better get on and do some work, especially since we probably won't be getting any orders from DCM any time soon. Pity. I was pretty sure I'd be able to get shot of 3 dozen TR-77Bs on them. The girl gave him a look that had annoyed him under other circumstances, but after all the fuss and aggravation, she was the least of his problems. He asked her for the map and pretended to study it while he pulled himself together. Now then, he said, Sedgley's. Not for the first time. He'd come across that smell. The first time, many years ago, but still crisp and sharp in his mind, lodged there like shrapnel from some old war, no bother most days, but gradually moving inwards, always pressing on the nerve. The stupid thing was, he should have missed it. He had no business being in there when it happened. He was breaking about a dozen school rules, and for what? Just some stupid dare. It had all been Benny's fault.
Chris had told them all, the headmaster, the girls' parents, the men from the government. Benny had dared him to spend the whole lunch break hiding in a cubicle of the girls' toilets. Why this was important to Benny, he had no idea, and it hadn't occurred to him to ask. Foot soldiers don't ask the field marshal what he wants the stupid hill for. He'd been given his orders, and that was that. The first 20 minutes had been really rather dull. He'd heard cubicle doors closing, the occasional whoosh of plumbing, nothing particularly titillating or suggestive of the hidden mysteries of biological otherness. He'd been wishing he'd brought his maths homework to be getting on with when he heard voices he recognised and froze. Karen Hitchings was asking Jill Ettin-Smith if she could borrow her RE notes. He didn't really give a damn about Karen Hitchings' opinion of him, but Jill was another matter entirely. She had the knack of being disappointed in people. The look that said, "I thought you were different," worse than detention. Chris concentrated on keeping perfectly still and breathing very quietly. The third voice, well, they always go round in threes, don't they? He couldn't make out who it was, so he consulted his mental database of school political alliances. Karen and Jill used to go around with Amelia Morris, but earlier that term Amelia had defected to the Cool Gang and Ellie Krantz had been co-opted to replace her. 5 would get you 1. Therefore, that third voice was that of Ellie, about whom he knew nothing and cared less. Then the smell. Because it was all flowery and sweet, Chris had assumed it was some kind of toiletry or cosmetic. From its intensity, he guessed someone had just spilled the bottle. The conversation stopped abruptly. He felt a cramp of fear in his stomach at they seen the toes of his palpably masculine shoes through the gap under the door, and then the scream. Some years later, when he'd moved in with Karen Hitchins, he'd tried to ask her what she'd seen, what had actually happened, but she'd pretended she hadn't even heard the question, and he knew better than to mention the subject ever again. Jill had only told him what she'd told the government people. A demon had appeared out of nowhere, killed poor Ellie, ripped her head off her shoulders and vanished, taking the head with it. And afterwards, when his parents collected him from the school, and he'd worked so hard to find the words to tell them, Jill Ettin-Smith said it was a demon, like from hell, and I know it sounds stupid, but I believe her. I think demons must be real. And they'd looked at each other and then at him, and his dad had said,
"We believe you, son. We know they're real. Listen."
Which was how Chris had come to learn about the reality of magic, the existence of sorcerers and demons, and what Grandpa had really done for a living, and how these things ran in families, and for all they knew he might have it too, which had turned out to be the case, though, according to the government people who did the tests, he was little better than borderline, but no real chance of him ever being able to practice professionally, even if he went to university and did the degree course. Certainly no scholarship, which he'd have to have, since you couldn't get a student loan for thaumaturgical studies. And that was that, which was why he now carried the bag for JWW retail, as close as he'd ever get to the real thing. Maybe because Chris was still in shock, and therefore not really trying, he managed to shift a phenomenal amount of stuff off on Sedgley's, including 4 dozen BB-27Ks with display materials and a dump bin. He thanked them automatically, wrote the order up in the book and drifted back to the car. "Might as well stop for lunch now," he heard himself say. "There's a pub on our way to Milford and Shales. Miserable place, but it means we won't have to go out of our way. All right by you?" "Okay." Miserable, as it turned out, was putting it mildly. The landlord made them feel about as welcome as a notifiable disease. The food took half an hour to arrive, and even the pub cat wouldn't touch the sausages. That, as far as Chris was concerned, was just fine. It wasn't really a happy day, and anything nice or fun would have seemed faintly grotesque.
"I don't know the exact figures,"
he was saying, replying to the girl's question.
"There's more of them about than you'd think, but not enough to be a real problem. We keep the lid on it pretty well, which is why you don't see anything about them on the telly. Actually, an attack's generally quite good for business. We sell quite a few demon-related products. Early warning alarms, liquid demon repellent, pepper sprays."
"Pepper sprays?" Chris nodded.
"Didn't you know? They're an endangered species. Though not nearly endangered enough, if you ask me. Still, there it is. You and I can't go round knocking them off. It's got to be done by trained, authorised personnel, so yes, pepper sprays. They tell me nothing pisses a demon off quite as thoroughly as a face full of pepper, but that's the law.
Oh, Angela said. That's stupid.
He shrugged.
Not up to me, he said. Also, to be fair, they're bloody hard to kill. A friend of mine works for the department. You know, those comedians we met back there, and apparently you need very specialised kit, not the sort of thing that fits neatly in your handbag or jacket pocket. Anyhow, he added, as she started to ask another question, let's not talk about it anymore, if you don't mind. All right.
She shrugged too, but he could see she wasn't happy.
If you like,
she said.
Thanks. So,
Chris went on, taking a deep breath.
Apart from that, how are you finding it?
What?
The business, the thrill of the open road, the challenge of hand-to-hand marketing. About what you'd expect.
Another shrug.
More or less,
Angela said.
Though, really, it's not about, well, magic, is it? You might as well be selling envelopes or toilet rolls.
Yes, Chris said. Except I wouldn't be, because all that stuff's done by technology now. Electronic point-of-sale reordering and centralised buying. But this is an old-fashioned business, so they still need reps, which is just as well for me, really.
I suppose.
Angela looked away, then down at her fingernails, which were bitten short.
Anyway, I get the general idea. You go around the shops and try and get them to buy stuff. That's about it, isn't it?
Broadly speaking.
Chris offered a corner of his fried bread crust to the cat. It stared at him, yowled and ran away.
Still, it's as close to the interesting stuff as I'll ever get. Not like you with your high-powered research.
Actually, it's mostly pretty boring, Angela replied. I mean, when I was a kid, I thought it'd be all invisibility cloaks and turning people into frogs, but it's not like that. Really, the only difference between what I'm doing and ordinary physics and chemistry is that there's a little chip of knowing stone inside my calculator instead of silicon, so it don't need batteries.
Chris nodded.
We sell those, he said. They're not very reliable, though. Drop them or leave them out in the sun and they're knackered.
All in all,
a long, fraught day.
Karen was out when Chris got home, so he defrosted a pizza and sat down in front of the telly. Nothing on the news about the grisly murder of a shopkeeper in the West Midlands, so maybe he'd imagined it after all. He was halfway through his pizza when the phone rang.
Chris?
There was an edge to her voice, but he could understand that.
Hi, Jill. How did you get on with her?
Did you open my carrier bag before you gave it back?
He jumped. I saw the phone had bitten his ear.
What? No, of course.
There was a sealed packet of biscuits in there, and now there's just a wrapper.
So the day hadn't finished with him quite yet.
Was there?
Yes.
Chris hesitated.
I guess Karen must have eaten them. I left the bag on the kitchen table. She must have wandered down in the night and...
They were plain digestives. She hates plain digestives.
Does she?
Yes.
Less than friendly tusk noise.
I know that for a fact, Chris. She was my best friend at school. Remember?
And he, Karen's long-term significant other, hadn't got a clue what sort of biscuits she did and did not like, but Jill, he happened to know, adored chocolate hobnobs.
Is that right? He said. I never...
Which means,
Jill continued grimly,
she would not have eaten them. But somebody did.
He really wasn't in the mood for anything like this.
Look, for crying out loud, Jill, I'll buy you another damn packet of biscuits, all right? But for the record, I didn't eat...
I don't care about the biscuits. I want to know if you looked in the bag. Well, I know you did,
she went on. Had he ever heard her this angry before? Not as far as he could remember.
What I need to know is exactly what you did.
This is silly, Chris thought.
Jill and her stupid bloody carrier bags. All right,
he said. I may have just glanced inside it quickly as I was putting it down on the...
You just looked. You didn't take anything out.
No.
You mean no apart from the biscuit?
From silly to annoying. Evolution in action. I didn't touch the fucking biscuits. I don't like plain digestives either. Just as soon as eat plywood. And no, I didn't touch anything in the stupid bag, all right?
Silence at the other end. Anybody else, and he'd have construed it as sulking, only Jill never sulked. Mind you, Jill never freaked out about anything as trivial as biscuit theft either. But when she spoke again, her voice was different, not less agitated, but clearer in her mind maybe. All right, she said, if you're absolutely sure.
Yes.
Fine. That's all I needed to know.
Pause.
You haven't got a dog or a cat or anything like that, have you?
You know we haven't, Jill, because of Karen's asthma.
Yes, of course. Mice? Rats?
No.
And this time, well, not relief, but the lowering of tension that comes with a mystery solved, even if the solution is unpalatable. So, you really have no idea what could have eaten the biscuits?
No.
As Chris said it, he frowned, and the question formed in his mind. So if it wasn't Karen, who the hell did eat the... Okay, thanks for clearing that up.
But I didn't, he thought. There's been something weird going on, and I can't account for it.
Sorry if I came across a bit nasty. I didn't mean to bite your head off.
Pause. Freudian slip, if that was the term he was looking for. At any rate, it could be taken as a perfectly valid explanation for Jill stressing out like that.
Talking of which,
he said, his voice a little higher and falsely cheerful.
Did you find the thingamy that did in poor Mr. Newsom?
No.
Definitely not happy about that.
By the time we got there, the trail had gone cold. We even tried scrying in water, but it knew what it was doing, covered its tracks very well.
Long pause, then...
Is Karen there?
No, she's out.
When you see her, maybe it'd be better not to talk about it,
Jill said, sounding much more like herself.
Because of, well, you know, what happened. I happen to know it's a very sore subject with her. She can get a bit extreme about it, and if she gets the idea there's one on the loose out there, it could mess her up a bit, so keep quiet about it, will you?
Sure, Chris replied without thinking, mostly relieved because Jill was back to normal. And there's no reason why the subject should come up. We're not exactly had a nice day at the office, dear kind of household. He hesitated for a moment, then said, Look, about your biscuits, I'll get you another...
Forget about it,
Jill said, and she sounded quite normal.
Actually, your poltergeist or whatever it was probably did me a favour. I really can't afford to go stuffing my face with biscuits unless I want to end up looking like a small whale.
End of conversation. Chris put the phone down, then looked at it for a few seconds, as though he suspected it of playing games with him. Yes, all right. Post-traumatic stress syndrome, or whatever the medical term was. Maybe Jill was a little bit off her head tonight because of what she'd seen at the shop. But that still left the problem of what had munched its way through an entire packet of digestive biscuits, and the more he thought about that, the stranger it became. Furthermore, now he came to think of it, the unidentified muncher had eaten all the bickies and then put the wrapper back in the bag. Karen wouldn't have done that. She'd have binned it, no doubt breathing a heavy sigh as she did so because it was non-recyclable, and it'd have had to been a fairly sophisticated mouse. Under the circumstances, if he'd had a problem like that, he'd have phoned Jill, who'd either have explained it away in 10 seconds flat or told him not to be so stupid as to worry about it. Option not available. Chris sat down with his half-a-cold pizza on his lap and tried to rationalise it, but his mind kept slipping off it, as though it had been waxed. Karen got home just after 10, in a foul mood, overtired and overwrought.
There'd been a screw-up at work, she explained, and she'd had to stay on and sort it all out in time for the meeting tomorrow. Chris didn't ask for details, and she didn't offer them. He heard her slamming cabinet doors in the bathroom as he closed his eyes and went to sleep. He had the dream again. Not that he minded. It was a nice dream. His favourite. He was in the car, somewhere in Staffordshire, although the view through the window was of mountains, their sides covered in an endless sea of pine trees, shimmering faintly grey in the summer heat. Sitting beside him, she'd just said, "At the end of the road, turn left," though the road went on, straight as an arrow, as far as the eye could see. "The road is very long," he said. He talked like that, in the dream. "You will know when the time comes to turn left," she replied. "How will I know?" "I will be here to tell you." He didn't look round. "I'm glad you'll be here with me when the turning comes," he said. "I am always with you," she said, and he could feel the warmth of her radiance and the edges of his vision blurred golden from the light that shone from her, and he passed a signpost that said Stoke-on-Trent, 455 miles. Oh, good, he thought, because when he saw that sign, it meant it was the point in the dream where he was allowed to ask one question and still be able to remember the answer when he woke up. It was amazing, the sort of stuff she knew about, and she'd never been wrong yet. "SatNav," he said. "Who ate the biscuits?" Silence for a while, and then she said, "The one who is to come ate the biscuits, Chris." Oh, he thought, never wrong yet. But there were some nights when she came over all cryptic, which was only to be expected when he considered that she was just his problem-solving subconscious mind, sublimated into the form of the only entity in the world he really trusted. "I do not know who that is," he said. It was all right to admit stuff like that, in the dream. In real life, of course, women expect you to be bloody telepathic. "When the time comes, you will know," she said. "After 654 miles, prepare to turn left." Oh, no, you don't, he thought. So he asked, "Who is the one who is to come, SatNav?" "The one who is to come will unite the children who fell," she replied. "The one who is to come will lead them along the road they have to travel, taking the third exit at the next roundabout. But you will not remember that when you wake up, because it is still hidden." Oh, well, he thought, fair enough. Why did the one who is to come steal Jill's biscuits, SatNav? He persevered, and in front of him the road narrowed, hedges closing in around him like the fingers of a grasping hand. "I do not know," she replied. "Presumably the one who is to come happens to like plain digestives, though personally I prefer Maryland chocolate chip cookies." For some reason, a great surge of joy swept through him as she said that, and he was about to tell her that he liked them too when Karen wriggled, made a noise like a pig, and dragged all the bedclothes over to her side, waking him up. "Ooh, well, who is to come? Who are the children following the path? What does SatNav know that he doesn't? What does Jill know that he doesn't? And moreover, who ate the digestives? And how can they like them more than chocolate hobnobs? Because chocolate hobnobs are the best thing in the world, apparently. Not that I can eat them because they've got oats in. But they smell nice. Ah, bickies are the best thing in the world. Custard creams. What's your favourite biscuit? What one do you like most of all? I've cracked the recipe for Nice biscuits, I think. I'm going to try them next time I bake some cookies. I did some over the Easter period. I kind of grated some chocolate orange and milled up some coconut peels. Like, you know, the kind of like the coconut shreds and stuff. And then I made some cookies, which were really squidgy. And they're really nice. And they taste like Nice biscuits. So next time I'm just going to do them with coconut. See if that works. Sorry for the waffle. Went off on a bit of a tangent there. But apparently that is a good thing, to go off on tangents. Yes, I have been advised professionally that it is a good thing to allow your mind to whiffle on and wander, apparently. Anyway, let me know what you thought about this chapter. Let me know what your favourite biscuits are. And who's the funniest boss you've ever fought in a computer game or seen in a film or a book? Anything really. I always like hearing from you guys. And of course, if you could bing the like button, it does wonders for me. And the notifications bell if you want to hear about the like kind of instant premieres. Because when I do them at 7 p.m. GMT, I always set them as a premiere so everybody knows what's going on. Yes. And anyway, have a great day. Thank you very much for listening. Have good sleepies if it's night time. And yes, big hugs and loves. So I'm off, Petal. I'll be back in a couple of days. Take it easy and stay safe. Me. I freaking love that tune. Anyway, take it easy.